Hello everybody and welcome to the round glass review for the Olympus Zuiko Auto Macro 50mm f3.5. Wait, guys, are we going to let them get away with that? And you know what I'm talking about, calling this a macro lens when it doesn't reach 1:1 in lens. No, we are not going to. We did not let the Nikkor 55mm f3.5 get away with that, and we're not taking that here either. This is a close-up lens. Don't let the name fool you. This lens was made from 1972 through 2002 in 4 iterations, which I'll detail momentarily. It's ideally suited for macro, which is to say really close-up work, and that's a big duh because it's in the name. But like most macro lenses, this one will be amazing for portraits as well. As a 50mm lens, it also works well as a general-use lens that allows exceptional close focus. This lens, in its staggering 30-year production run, had 4 iterations. I don't have years for all of them, but the Alan Wood link in the description will provide some additional details. In short, serial numbers from 101 to somewhere in 127, that's the series, by the way, are the first 3 digits of the serial numbers, were the first batch of these lenses. There was a short run of the 127 that followed behind, and all it did was change the cosmetics, adding a black front ring instead of the original silver front ring. The third series, of which the lens in this video is part, ran from the 131 to 202 series lenses, and added MC, which stands for multi-coating, to the lens name. And that's likely just because everyone else in the industry was doing that, and in that time frame, probably the 80s, all of the lens makers were just hyping up their coatings and how big a deal coatings were. The last version of this lens, which was the series 203 to 263, dropped MC from the name and went back to the original naming convention. For your bottom line up front, this lens is excellent across the focus and aperture ranges. The floating element system built into the optical formula does a great job of providing excellent image quality at close focus points. That said, Alan Wood indicates, and I concur based on experience, that this lens is best at 1:10 magnification, and by the way, that does seem pretty much industry standard for 50 to 55mm f3.5 macro, close focus lenses of this lens's vintage. 1:10 magnification on this lens is a focus distance of 2 feet. And this, by the way, hints that this lens is going to perform exceptionally well for shoulder-up portraits on 35mm and full frame. The focal length and angle of view are 50mm and 47 degrees on full frame, with an equivalent of 75mm and 31.8 on APS-C. Aperture range is 3.5 to 22. The element and group count are 5 and 4. The design type double gauze. Filter size 49mm. Closest focus is 0.23 meters, with a closest working distance of about 0.11 meters, which respectively in the US we call the appropriate height and appropriate diameter for a small cup of coffee. The drive type is manual focus only. The native mount is Olympus OM, and that's the film era OM. Dimensions are 60 by 40 millimeters, and it weighs in at a fairly dense, for that size, 200 grams. My first tip, you're going to be familiar with this if you've seen any of the videos in this series, so you can say it along with me. Mirrorless shooters. This is a great standard lens for you, especially if you get an OM to your mount macro adapter. This lens needs an added 25mm of throw to reach 1:1 magnification. So measure the maximum amount of throw on your adapter, and if it hits 25mm, then you're at 1:1 with this lens on your mirrorless camera. On Sony E, an Infinity OM macro adapter ought to provide 26mm of throw. One challenge with this lens, being a budget lens, is that it lacks a lot of the vital macro information needed for calculations. For instance, the focusing scale has the magnification factors marked, but provides no guides for how to calculate exposure with the OM system tube 25 mounted between the lens and the film era camera, or your adapter today. Now today, that's honestly not so much of an issue because your modern camera, especially your modern digital camera, can meter quite well with this lens even when it's extended on a tube or a macro adapter. So to that end, for macro work beyond what is built into this lens, skip the film era bodies unless you have a very good handle on how to perform rule of inverse squares calculations, and stick to macro work for mirrorless cameras. I noted the floating element system up front. Olympus, in their technical books of the era, indicated this lens was the first macro lens to incorporate a floating element into the lens for the specific purpose of correcting close-up image aberrations. In a nutshell, aberrations are not static across a lens magnification range. This, in theory, is true of any lens, of course, unless the lens optical design has some method built in to alter how aberrations are corrected at different focal points. Next up, crop sensor users. You may be inclined to use a speed booster on this lens because of the relatively slow maximum aperture. Well, good news, full-frame users. If you don't mind a slight crop, you can use one too. The 0.7x OM to Sony E speed booster that I have, as these images show, vignettes slightly, but a minor crop, still larger than the APS-C area, can remove that light loss. Also, to my eye, this lens pairs well with speed boosters, which seem to tame the lens's propensity toward chaotic out-of-focus areas when focused close up. As an asterisk, when I was buying speed boosters a few years ago, the only OM to E model I could get was about $200, so quite frankly, it ought to perform well. And anytime some added glass not in the optical design lands behind a lens, that can deliver unpredictable results. A different speed booster than the one I use may affect performance differently. My last tip, keep your sensor clean. As I say with all macro lenses, close focus causes the light rays from the lens to arrive on the sensor in a nearer to parallel orientation, and this highlights sensor dust spots, and can do so even when wide open because of the relatively slow maximum aperture. Cleaning a dusty sensor in post is a lot of work. This video's Zidal analysis will examine 3 photos, the Lonely Speck test chart, and then 2 out-of-focus balls shots, one at infinity and one at minimum focus. Starting with the last 2 shots, the infinity shot shows some mechanical vignetting in the blurry balls. This may be adapter related. I don't see evidence of this occurring when I look through the lens without an adapter, say on a film camera. Close focus shot eliminates the mechanical vignette, interestingly, and exchanges that for a revelation about how dusty my camera lens was the day I took these test shots. The last shots here will examine the test chart, and these test shots, by the way, are always done wide open. In the middle, we see exemplary performance with some exceptionally slight chromatic aberration off the center axis. This doesn't get any worse until the very image corners where the dots exhibit a slight increase in chromatic aberration and a very slight sagittal astigmatism. One item to note is that this astigmatism is very slightly worse at the top of the corners than the bottom, and a bit of a coma manifests on the top too. So in a nutshell, the analysis shows that this lens performs remarkably well. Compared to lenses of the time, the performance would be top tier. Compared to a lens of this type made today, performance would still be considered excellent. This lens is tiny. I can't express how small these elements are well in the format of this video. Most of this lens housing is mechanical. An interesting observation about this lens, when looking at the front element with a light in the background, you'll see 3 light point reflections when you have the aperture closed. And that stands to reason, being that there are 3 elements in front of the aperture. Racking focus causes one of those reflections to spread out from the other very slightly, which ought to be an indication that the front element is the floating element. That's my hypothesis anyway. Breathing is noticeable when either switching between 2 focus points in still images or in video. This test, showing a focus throw of 0.7 meters, exhibits a lot of breathing. The aperture is stepped in full stops. The front element is non-rotating, but it does move in and out a whopping 25 millimeters. That's 50% of the lens's focal length, which stands to reason because this lens can reach a magnification of 1 to 2 as built. Focus throw is around 310 degrees. The focus ring is narrow and has a nice rubber grip, but it does move in and out slightly as focus racks. Focus damping is simply stunning, though as with all vintage lenses, your mileage on that will vary. Autofocus effect on audio is not applicable because this is a manual focus lens only. Sharpness will not leave you wanting at all. This lens is a stunner in that regard. I've read reviews that indicate this lens is not much sharper than a consumer 58mm f1.8 lens, and wow, do I disagree with those reviews. Across the aperture range, this lens performs very well. Build quality is, in keeping with vintage Zuiko lenses, incredible. Unless you buy one of these that was horribly abused, it will handle and feel superb. Contrast, even in RAW files, is top-notch. Your images will be very easy to contrast control any RAW workflow, and your final image results will exhibit a hard-to-calculate level of vintage Zuiko contrast and the associated color richness that comes from it. Aperture stars are generally ho-hum. At f/22 you can get them, but they're very diffraction smeary. In fact, in this video's f/22 sample shot, if you look closely, you can see a diffraction interference pattern in some of the star's smearing areas. Hint, check the red ones. Out of focus areas, as noted, are chaotic when focused close, but taking a step back and focusing further out, the out-of-focus areas are generally pleasing with a relatively good subject isolation at the wider apertures. Distortion, noting a bit of camera tilt on my part, is generally well controlled, though the sides of the image exhibit minor barrel distortion, but nothing you'll ever notice except with graph paper. Light loss, when focused on a white monitor up close with the lens focused at infinity, is apparent wide open but functionally gone by f/5.6. There is some very minor light drop-off across apertures. Nothing from f/5.6 to smaller apertures should be noticeable in a setting outside of this artificially contrived testing ground. Glare and ghosting are unknowns. Owing to this lens' deeply set front element, I could not get this lens to either flare or ghost. Balance with cameras is fine across the camera range, and with full-frame mirrorless cameras that owes to the lens being on an adapter. This lens does, however, feel better when mounted on a smaller camera. For instance, I preferred using it on my A7S II versus my A7 IV, though it does really handle well on both. This is the second 50mm class f3.5 macro lens that I've reviewed in this series, and I'm using the Canon FDn 50mm f3.5 heavily right now so that I can review it in 2024. Were I to make a broad proclamation about the three, this, the Canon, and the Nikkor, this is my favorite due solely to the size and handling. It feels nice and it works well. The image quality is stunning and will leave even the most discerning users wanting for nothing. But the Nikkor has a bit more character in the image rendition. But at the same time, look at the images in this video. This lens delivers sharp focus areas that blend and blur smoothly into nearby blurry areas, an effect that's especially noticeable at close focus. Blurry areas themselves are, with the right conditions, quite pleasing. The colors this lens delivers too are rich, saturated, lifelike, and stunning to behold. And all of that is on top of this lens's incredible usability with a highly suitable close focus point for general photography that pairs well with this lens size and ability to reach infinity focus. So look, here's the most important and best thing I can say about this lens. If you wanted to have a single 50mm lens as your last 50mm lens, this one should not just be on that list, it should probably be first on that list.